Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by...
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza, marriage and family therapist.
We are all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and to fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms.
Please remember that even though we are all licensed therapists, we aren't your therapist.
If you are struggling with mental health symptoms, please find a local mental health provider.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife.
You can't even keep it together. Welcome to season 5, everybody.
Welcome to season 5. So today we're going to be doing a delayed release of our Valentine's Day episode. Unfortunately, our first recording of this episode was sacrificed to the technological gods. So we are doing it again for you. So we're going to be talking about Pride and Prejudice. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the theme of anxiety as sort of our overall overarching umbrella theme. We're going to be specifically addressing 3 main characters, Mrs. Bennett, Darcy, and Lizzie Bennett, with a little bit of Charlotte Lucas in there as well. So just a brief overview of a story that is over 100 years old. So Pride and Prejudice is about a family called the Bennetts that has 5 daughters. And these 2 rich guys, come into town, and the Bennett girls kind of try to get married off basically to them, or their mother does, and they succeed partially. Is that a good overview? Hannah, you look stressed.
Do they not both succeed?
They do both succeed. I mean, I'll put it this way. It's a kind of an old school rom-com where these 2 guys who have very different energies, Darcy and Bingley, come into town. They cause a stir because they're rich and hot, and all the local ladies want to marry them. And then 2 of the Bennett girls, Jane and Lizzie, end up marrying them, but not without a bunch of shenanigans in between. Perfect. So let's jump right into it, because I think the most glaring figure in this movie is Mrs. Bennett. When we're talking about anxiety, we kind of all had a general consensus that Mrs. Bennett is the only character in the movie that we would genuinely diagnose with an anxiety disorder.
Yeah, she's the one that meets criteria that we see over the period of time required to get the diagnosis. I think that's something that in movies that it's hard to diagnose people because you don't see them meet the time criteria of a diagnosis, which people ignore. They go, oh, they have this, this, and this. But anxiety is an emotion as well as a disorder. It must exist in order for it to be broken. So people get those things mixed up. It's possible to have anxiety without having anxiety disorder, but Mrs. Bennett is for sure disordered.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about an anxiety disorder, we're referring to generalized anxiety disorder, also known as GAD, shorthand, or GAD, within like the world of clinicians. And so what specific criteria of GAD are we seeing Mrs. Bennett display?
We are seeing her display excessive worry for a period of over 1 month. Mm-hmm. And we are seeing that worry transcend situations. So it's happening in more than one setting about more than one thing, which is where the generalized part comes from. It's not just worry about social stuff. She's worried about literally everything. And we also see her with some difficulty concentrating. We see her with some irritability. Restlessness, tension. Mm-hmm.
Psychosomatic symptoms, like she gets really quote unquote sick in the middle, like in the middle of the movie, which my wager would be related to her anxiety.
Yep. And for anxiety specifically mentioned in the criteria is a stomach problem. So you get the bubble guts that can be from anxiety.
She also maybe drinks a little bit too much because she's clearly hungover in the scene after the ball where she is drinking that drink that has like raw eggs in it and like milk or something. Doesn't seem like it would help, but who am I to question 1700s hangover cures?
Well, the interesting thing about anxiety is that people think it's chronic mental illness that is most commonly associated with substance use, but it is not. It is anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
Because people who are anxious will do anything to make it stop.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I feel like that's definitely something that, in terms of some of the work that I did, that we all did when we worked at Thresholds, working with people, in my experience, mostly male presenting people who had extreme anxiety, and most of them struggled with alcohol abuse, or substance abuse. Actually, it doesn't even really matter what the substances, but substance use disorder, because that was how they were trying to self-medicate their anxiety and feeling uncomfortable in situations. And so I think that, and also I think it would make a lot of sense that Mrs. Bennett would have a lot of anxiety going out into the world and not being at home. Even though it seems like she enjoys it a little bit, it would make a lot of sense that she is really anxious, because essentially it's like going to the store and offering her children up as like options. Yeah. Like when they're going to a ball, like it very much the goal of going to a ball is getting starting a relationship and getting your children, like them starting a relationship with someone or getting seen in general, so that people know that there are options within their family.
Right. Getting some suitors to send letters that they would like to make a social call.
Hell yeah. Because the central focus of Mrs. Bennett's anxiety in the movie and how she articulates her anxiety is that she has 5 daughters in a patriarchal society. So where we can kind of throw her a bone, like, is that some of her anxiety is created by and perpetuated by the systems that she lives within. So a reality that she is working within is that everything they own, their home, their money, everything will be given to a male cousin because of how inheritance worked at that time. And so we can definitely meet Mrs. Bennett where she's at, is that there is legitimate anxiety about what's going to happen to me, to my children, when my husband dies, because everything we own will go to Mr. Collins, this cousin that we barely know. And so going to these balls, like you were saying, Hannah, there's probably a lot of pressure she's putting on the situation of, this is my opportunity to not just get my daughters wed, but to save our lives. Yeah. That's, I think, the pressure for her internally. And she's not wrong. And she's not managing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a part of the way we see her managing it is by using a substance to try and manage it that she does not do well either. So it really doesn't work no matter what she's looking at. But yeah. I think a part of what I know I experience when I work with clients who struggle with anxiety is that once there is something that actually can reinforce what you're worried about or scared about, and you have something in front of you and you have something that you can point to and say, well, Hannah, but this actually happened to me once. So now I have something that can reinforce why I have this fear and why it's okay for me to be afraid of this. And so that's hard. That's hard to pull back and say, okay, that is also one experience that you had. And how can we, because the other piece of any diagnosing of any mental health diagnosis across the board, no matter what it is that it has to be having a big impact on your life. It has to be having a big impact in your relationships, on your ability to keep a job, on you being able to feel content and feel like you're getting the things that you need out of the life that you're living. And so for any disorder, it has to affect that part of your life. And so I think Mrs. Bennett is a great example of that, of where it's affecting, I think, her marital relationship. I think it's affecting her relationship with her children.
100%.
I think it's affecting her relationship with other women who are the same age as her, who maybe don't have as many daughters, because that's all she talks about.
Her social skills seem like straight up trash. Her boundaries are abysmal. Like the way that she talks about Charlotte, like calling her plain because she's quote unquote like competition, you know what I mean, for her daughters. Like it definitely, you can see how she has no consciousness about how, or awareness of how she comes off to others because she's so wrapped up in her internal dysregulation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so another reason why she would be diagnosable is because it's definitely having an impact on her life. And so in terms of that, again, going back to when I'm helping people who have anxiety, is it can be really hard to hold on to a different thought or belief about something you've already experienced. And so that kind of complicates the way that the person that I'm working with views the chance of something happening again, which is also a way that anxiety is reinforced in general.
So I think maybe an interesting thing to talk about, I don't know how much we've ever talked about this, is there is a diagnosis called adjustment disorder, which is when you have anxiety symptoms or mood symptoms related to an external stressor, like my daughters are of marriaging age in a society that is not going to take care of us if they don't get married. Mm-hmm. But I think and so basically the idea of adjustment disorder is that if this external stressor was not around, or if we could eliminate it, then you would go back to quote unquote normal. Like you'd be going back to like regular functioning. I think where we see Mrs. Bennett not have adjustment, but genuinely have generalized anxiety disorder is that even when her children start getting married, she still has what we call like a labile affect, where she's still really all over the place. Like even when Lydia gets married and Lydia's driving away with her probably abusive husband, she starts weeping about the fact that like she's sad and anxious about the fact that Lydia won't be around anymore. So I think kind of what you're speaking to, Hannah, is anxiety is like a weed. It's in that it will find a place to grow. And it's like a whack-a-mole too, where if you hit it down in one area, it'll pop up in another. And so that's always a good indicator to me as a clinician of if this is generalized anxiety, like free-floating anxiety, because even when she gets the thing that should fix the problem, fix her anxiety, she's still not contented and she's still not regulated.
She is not. And what an important caveat of like why else, when we look at the differential diagnosing process of why it's this, not that, which is what that means. Differential diagnosis is that in order to meet the criteria for adjustment disorder, it must be a new situation.
True.
And that's the effects of that situation can persist for a long time. Like if somebody dies and they continue to have issues that are primarily related to that, you can make the argument that it's due to the effects of that. But with this society being what it is, what we see in this situation causing her anxiety would not meet criteria because it's not really a new thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Her daughters they're not just coming of age. This is something they've been dealing with for a while. So
yeah. And she hasn't gotten any better in managing her. Like her tolerance hasn't increased of the situation. It's probably gotten worse or stayed the same.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't know.
Yeah. No, we don't know. But I do feel like it would make sense that the longer that her daughters go unmarried, the more intense her anxiety is. Mm-hmm. And so we could also have been seeing her, which we don't know because the movie doesn't show this part, nor does the story for that matter, that we could be seeing her at her most anxious when most of her daughters are of marrying age. I don't. Whatever. Because
you're right. Because Lydia and Kitty are finally like 15 and 16, which I think is kind of the youngest you can be to be quote unquote out, as they say, like out in society. Yeah. And so, you're right. This might be the first year that all 5 girls are eligible and all 5 girls have yet to be married. And so, and like that is a social faux pas. Like we see that in the dinner scene with, I think it's Lady Catherine de Bourgh, when she's like, all 5 of you out without the oldest ones getting married.
Yeah, like they had because the patriarchal society, of course, cannot have anything than more rules for young women, which is
and also pitting you against your siblings.
And also if your oldest sibling doesn't get married first, then the rest of you don't have a chance. Yeah. Like that's bonkers. But that's what Catherine is speaking to when she makes that comment to her.
which, I think it's important to mention that just because there's a cause for the anxiety doesn't mean it can't cross the threshold of being an anxiety disorder.
Absolutely.
And I think clients struggle with that quite often, going like, well, no, I'm anxious because of this. Yes, but you also have been anxious for a persistent amount of time about that plus all of these other things. And that's what I think we see with her is her anxiety is related to the same topic, but it crosses over into too many other things that it could be just anxiety about that.
Because we do see like crossover. We see similar anxiety that I would attribute more to cultural stressors with Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Like she also has like similar boundary issues, like at the end of the movie when she barges into the Bennett's house because she thinks that Lizzie might be stealing her daughter's suitor from her. And I know that's because her daughter is ill. There's probably not a great chance that her daughter's not good marriage material, I guess, for a lack of a less horrible way to say it. And so there is that cultural anxiety that we're seeing in these other ways throughout the movie. And like we've already kind of said, but Mrs. Bennett is so all over the place. Like it's spilling into everything. It's not just I'm anxious in this specific way and it alters my behaviors in these specific ways. It's everything. Like just everything about her is so like, I think of her as loud. Like she's just so like loud and chaotic and really also pushing that narrative onto her daughters as well, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, she for sure has histrionic personality traits, but I'm not
and
saying
what
she
is
has,
that? And what is that, Ben?
Dramatic, expansive, labile mood, very much putting on I'll leave it there. But looking at what I say is personality traits, not personality disorder. I don't see any evidence that she has a personality disorder, but people can have traits that that get disordered. And we see her as being a person that is very prone to dramatics.
But also, I feel like, Ben, something that I want to add to that, because I feel like that could come across in a couple different ways, is that she is dysregulated, consists like all the time. So she doesn't experience calmness in her body.
Yeah.
She doesn't experience. So she is, and that I think what we're seeing, which again is definitely dramatics in terms of there's a different way to handle this. There's a different way to express your needs. There's a different way to share your thoughts and feelings with someone. That is absolutely true. That she is internally distressed all of the time. And so I think what I was thinking, Ben, as you were talking, and Brittany, as you were talking, is that this is a really, really great example of someone who has dysregulated emotions, who is not able to calm. I mean, definitely not their mind, but also definitely not their body in terms of the way that we experience her, what I would say maybe having a version of a panic attack when she's laying in bed, or at least maybe after she had already had a panic attack, because I don't know that we see her in quite that much distress, but how it's very physical. She's having very big physical responses. And a part of the reason why people who have anxiety sometimes experience psychosomatic symptoms, which the way that we talk about those are, the way that I think about it is this: when you are not able to read the signals that your body is giving you on a regular basis about how anxious you might be or how worried you are about something, your body and your brain figure out a different way to give you a signal about that. So a lot of times that can culminate in having IBS and having just stomach problems all over the place. It can affect sleep. It can affect, there's so many other pieces that our body and our brain are like, hey, you're not listening to us when your heart rate increases or when your hands get a little bit clammy, like you're not responding. So we have to do something bigger to help you figure out you have to deal with this, because we can't we can't be at 10 all the time. Nobody has the capacity to be at a 10 all of the time, which is the most anxious, most stressed, almost crisis mode that we can be in. That's not sustainable. So our brain and our body have to figure out a different way to tell us, which is why a lot of treatments that go along with a lot of the ways that I help people or that I talk to people about anxiety is, what does it feel like in your body? And how can we help you manage that feeling in a different way, or help you maybe feel for the first time what it feels like to be calm in your body? Because that is something that our brain needs. Our brain needs a chance to rest. It needs a chance to reset. And when we're constantly, then your body is full of cortisol, because that's a part of the response that the body has when you experience anxiety. It's a physiological response that like everybody has. It's not like there's something different about you if you don't feel that way. That's a regular thing that happens. And my guess would be that Mrs. Bennett is probably making enough cortisol, also known as adrenaline, for 2 people. Not known as adrenaline. I feel like you said that once, Ben. Okay, good. Because I don't think that's true either. And it's cortisol. It's cortisol.
Cortisol is the stress hormone. Adrenaline is fight or flight.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, gotcha. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that what's the most important thing to recognize is that the anxiety response exists to make us uncomfortable enough that we take actions that promote our survival in order to resolve the presenting threat. And cortisol is the stress hormone that starts to prime our body to receive adrenaline.
Yeah. There you go. Mm-hmm. So I feel like one of the things that we see in Mrs. Bennett is just she's just dysregulated. She's not really connected to her body, it seems, in terms of what she's experiencing and what it seems like her body is trying to tell her at the same time, which is why I think she presents as so frantic so consistently.
Mm-hmm. And I would say too, I guess another where I can like maybe give her some space too is my assumption as well. And this is me maybe inferring past the point of what makes sense, is that she got married pretty young. There does seem to be an age difference between her and Mr. Bennett. And so a part of her also reminds me of someone who's a little bit like arrested in development, that she's, presents as quite young as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if I charted her age, if like her emotional age is still pretty young. I mean, it's pretty obvious that her and Lydia are kind of like 2 peas in a pod. And I wouldn't be surprised if Mrs. Bennett was very similar, if not identical to Lydia at that age. And so if I was working with Miss Bennett, I'd probably keep that in mind. Like if she presents more as a teenager, like I might have to work with her more similarly how I would work with a teenager, in that she's just like the kind of impulsivity, the labile. I know, but like, what's the like
labile mood?
Just labile mood.
Labile affect.
Yeah. And so I think if she got married really young and then, moved to this household really young, like I wouldn't be surprised if she is kind of stuck in that headspace and never really grew past that, because then she got kind of sheltered into like family life. And also too, I mean, part of her dysregulation, I think, could also be attributed to Mr. Bennett. We don't see the progression of the relationship, but he is pretty invalidating towards her and really writes her off as a goof. And like, I mean, you could argue he's pretty disrespectful towards her. And so I wonder as well if just in the dynamic of that, if maybe she also only feels like she's taken seriously or even heard if she's really loud. Kind of the histrionic traits you brought up, Ben, like when she's loud and dramatic. And if I'm not loud and dramatic, no one takes me seriously. And not realizing that that behavior is what maybe prevents people from taking her seriously. But it's very similar to when I work with adolescents and they're like, they get really elevated and they go straight to that like screaming yelling, you know what I mean? Really dramatic stuff. And what I usually have to tell them is, I understand that you're feeling a big feeling right now. Like you're feeling something very big. And the way that you're presenting that information is allowing people to discredit you as a teenager. But with her, I might say is like, I don't know, whatever they would call a flouncy doofus in like their language back then, like a flibbertigibbet or something.
What just came out of your mouth?
Flibbertigibbet. You never heard that word before? That's a thing. I've heard it.
Yeah,
I've heard it before.
I'm sure she would be called one. And so
probably because you've hung out with Brittany. She just made it up in her brain.
That is not a word I made up. That is a real word.
That's a phrase.
Fans, I want you to write in, talk about how flibbertigibbet is a real word. But like, I think that's what I would approach her with is, I understand that. I don't know if I could spell it, but
I know
basically trying to help her understand that you can get heard without going to these extremes. And it actually, ironically, might help you get more heard and people understand the gravity of how you're feeling if you go less towards these extremes. Cause that's kind of the whole I'll sometimes fall into with teenagers is, but I have to be this loud and dramatic so people get it. And I'm like, I hear you. And they're not really hearing what you're saying. They're just hearing how you're saying it. Right. So, yeah.
And with couples, and Hannah, you can probably back me up here. It's a term I refer to as stacking, because when we see Mr. and Mrs. Bennett interact, he is very dismissive of her and just kind of pays her no mind, and kind of almost like hand waves, like does the little like, meh, whatever. And one of the things hurt people want to know two things and two things only, or stressed people, whatever, people who are having emotional needs that aren't getting met. They want to know two things. One, my emotions are being taken seriously and considered real and valid. Two, whatever's causing them is going to stop. And when those things aren't met, people start stacking more evidence on top of each other or more behaviors in order to be taken seriously and go, fine, you're not recognizing this. Let's add some more. Oh, you're not recognizing that either. Let's add some more. And you see that in couples arguments all the time. When it starts at one argument, they dismiss each other, and then 17 more build up on top of it. And nobody can keep track of which argument is being had right now.
That's true.
And then it's just all emotional outbursts and nobody's validating each other. And I feel like that's probably going on in this house, but one-sided, because Mr. Bennett is stonewalling her.
Yeah,
1,000%.
As much as I love him and his relationship with Lizzie, as a husband, and this is probably reinforced by the time period, he really is quite, I don't want to say unkind, but maybe I do, about what's going on with Mrs. Bennett. So is there anything else? Oh, go ahead.
I mean, if I had a client who presented in a relationship in that way and they were doing couples, there would definitely be some discussion about the stonewalling, and that if you want to have a healthy relationship, there has to be an exchange of thoughts and feelings in a way that feels comfortable for everybody. And that it can't be this where like you're allowed to do whatever you want and they have to just accept that, and just accept that you're not willing to give anything else to the relationship. Like, it doesn't really work that way. And Ben, in terms of working with couples, I mean, I feel like you're absolutely right. And at the same time, my experience is neither one of you are listening. What the fuck does it matter what you're saying? Because you're not listening to each other. So it doesn't fucking matter who did what. All that matters is you're both angry. You're both upset. You both probably have your feelings hurt. You both probably feel shitty. Let's figure out how to not feel like that anymore.
Yeah. Because we know exactly when they have this kind of fight. After Lizzie gets proposed to by Mr. Collins and they meet her at that pond, and, Darcy and the dad says, goes right, undermines mom. I mean, Mrs. Bennett's not acting kindly herself in that moment. Like, she's throwing down an ultimatum about her daughter's whole life out of her anxiety. She's making her anxiety Lizzie's problem in that moment and totally disregarding everything about Lizzie. And Mr. Bennett, I think by prioritizing his relationship with Lizzie, which I think we see him to time and time again in this movie, he totally undermines Mrs. Bennett. And I'm sure they had a screaming fight, or maybe Mrs. Bennett screamed at him and he just acted like she's a silly goose.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the most clear example of that is exactly when they were like standing in the woods and talking about marrying that dude is like, if you don't marry him, your mother will probably never talk to you again. If you do marry him, I will never talk to you again.
From this day forth, you will have to part from one of your parents. Believe it or not, I know a lot of these lines off the top of my head.
I mean, I think we both do.
I don't think that surprises anyone who's ever listened to this show.
So, is there anything else we want to touch upon with Mrs. Bennett before we move on to Mr. Tall, Dark, and Handsome himself?
Batman.
Nice try.
That's a good setup, though. That was a good setup, though.
I mean, you just laid it right there. I could not dunk on that. You just,
and I know because of your huge crush on Batman, of course, that would be the first person you think of.
Exactly.
So,
am I wrong?
The Batman of the Bruce Wayne of their time, Mr. Darcy. We'll jump into him. So, with Darcy and Anxiety, we see it slightly differently. He comes off, it's almost like a polar opposite of Mrs. Bennett, where his anxiety makes him really insular and actually come off as really introverted and standoffish and rude in like a very different way. How we're even introduced to him is he won't really talk to anybody. He won't dance with anybody. He just comes off as like a real snobosaurus Rex. And people just kind of write him off in the way that they write off Mrs. Bennett. Like he's a douche, basically. He's a rich douche.
A prick. Yeah.
Yeah. He's a rich prick. And I think as we learn more about his background, we learn that he came to this place out of a place of anxiety and trauma. I mean, that's the middle square of the bingo card that is the show, trauma. And so specifically with Darcy, it involves his sister, Georgiana, and Mr. Wickham, who we meet later in the story. And basically what we learn is that he grew up with Wickham. When his dad died, Darcy's dad died, Wickham got, because they grew up together.
Well, they grew up as, just one correction. They grew up as brothers, essentially.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, like front of house, back of house, like upstairs, downstairs, but yeah.
No, it seemed like he treated him like a son.
Yeah. But I guess
in a lot of ways. But
I wonder how much that was true, because his dad was quote unquote like the help. But I think Darcy's dad did take like Wickham sort of under his wing as like a child within the household.
Yeah.
He's Jon Snow.
Not that far, but kind of. And so when Darcy's dad died, Wickham got, inheritance from that. And then he squandered that, really mistreated Darcy, and then came back and tried to steal his sister basically and like elope with her in order to get his sister's fortune. And his sister was 15. And so I think what Darcy learned from that experience with Wickham is that I have to be overly protective of not just my sister, but myself, because we are seen as a prize to win. And so looking at everybody like a threat, kind of. And that's and that's what we see when he enters that ballroom in the beginning.
Yeah, I think, and it's fair for him to do so and recognize that, like, as you see him kind of being cold and standoffish, that is a perfectly acceptable response. It's one of the functions of a hypoarousal state where you freeze everybody out and keep them from having access to you. And we definitely see that is his move. Lizzie is the polar opposite. She gets hot and goes into hyperarousal. He stays in a hypoarousal state. He doesn't let people get in, doesn't let them get near him, because he views everybody as a potential threat who's trying to manipulate him and get his money in an inappropriate way. Not that he's a shyster or like shady, but he doesn't want to be taken advantage of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And he also, and I think also out of his friendship and love for his friend Bingley, I think that's why we see he acts the way that he acts when it seems like Bingley might be in the middle of another situation of being taken advantage of because he has money. And not because of who he is as a person. And so I think that's a part of what his reaction is when he is helping Bingley be like, look, like I've been listening and it seems like they really need the money. And it kind of seems like she seems kind of shut down a little bit, like Jane, like it's really hard to tell if she's interested in you. And so I think we kind of see him help his friend out of this traumatic experience, and also the way that he kind of views the world maybe now after having that experience with somebody that he grew up with and maybe felt at the very least close to in different ways, and probably kind of felt like they were the same or similar. Mm-hmm. And then to have it be put in his face so spectacularly and so awfully. And he was the one who had to pick up the pieces. He was the one who probably had an almost inconsolable 15-year-old sister.
Well, he was her dad pretty much at that point. Like, yeah, he's the primary caregiver of her.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where I was going with that, but
we see him just he's stuck in a protective state. We know that he's been through a traumatic experience. We're seeing a friend squander the riches that his dad left him, then try to manipulate for more, to see the evils that money can create in people and cause even the people closest to you to betray them. So for him to be suspicious, closed off, guarded, mm-hmm. and to
reactive.
He can be, yeah. Mm-hmm. But to see him like make assumptions out of a protective stance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like the second he sniffs like Jane being potentially not interested, he takes action to protect his friend from being taken advantage of.
And also Mrs. Bennett isn't doing anybody any favors by making it so obvious that she's trying to marry her daughters off to rich dudes.
You know, Super Troopers, I love it so much, but there's one little line that gets thrown away like in the movie, but desperation is a stinky cologne.
It really is.
Yeah, no doubt.
And you can smell her from a mile away. Yeah. And it'd be interesting to see Darcy when he was younger, because I think we see when we finally meet his sister, his energy and his personality with her, we see that protective stance fall. And it's like he's a totally different person. I wouldn't be surprised if that version of Darcy is what he was like before maybe his dad died.
Yeah. Or if that's how he presents with people that he trusts.
Yeah.
And loves. And so he, that's him. That is him being himself when being out, much like Batman, when being out in the world, he has to wear this different mask. And in order to feel comfortable to interact with other people, which I think would make a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm. And you can see,
I think for Darcy, that unlike Batman, that this is the mask. We see his mask drop when he's with his sister.
Yeah.
With Bruce is the mask and Batman is the real him.
I know.
And so I think too, and I think the dilemma for Darcy in this movie and where his anxiety, I think, does genuinely peak is he starts to fall in love with Elizabeth, and that requires to be in love with someone requires vulnerability and openness. And so in that first proposal scene, when he's like, there's like just the one where there's the one where he almost proposes and she suggests tea and he looks like he's going to barf on himself. Like, so that's his first attempt. His anxiety takes him over and he just like dips. And then the second time, and this is where I think you can really see his anxiety. He's like, I like you, but I know all the stuff that you can do to hurt me. And I know that your family's ridiculous. It's like he can't help himself but talk about all the reservations that he has, which I think is him still trying to cling on to his like protective stance while also trying to get his heart's desire, I guess. And so he's trying to play both sides of that still. And that's why it falls on its face so spectacular, because he doesn't also realize how insulting he's being. Like, that's where his kind of lack of awareness really comes into play too.
Are we talking about the hyper dramatic scene in the rain where he's
yes,
like, like
I overlooked everything wrong with you, so you're welcome.
Yeah, where he catastrophically fails at being communicating what he wants to, and he's like tearing her down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what we see, which is honestly pretty realistic, is there's a natural consequence to his behavior. She says, no, you can go fuck yourself. And then he has to kind of grow. He has to leave and grow and kind of get to a point where he is ready to actually genuinely be vulnerable with her. And that's when they finally can succeed as a couple, which is what, like, if I was working with him as a therapist, I think that'd be like a perfect progression of, okay, let's take some space. Let's work on ourselves individually. And then when we're ready, we go back to the person that we want to be with. Because he has to do his own individual healing for that to work.
We have to, like, both of them have to get out of parts activity and into like their core self. And when I say parts activity, parts refers to the different functions of our personality that can take on roles that our regular self isn't capable of, that we might need in order to protect ourselves. Like, the mama bear role, like your average mom is probably not going to be able to actively beat someone to death. But if you hurt her child, it's going to come out.
A weird example, but okay.
Hey, mama bear is a strong concept that everybody can identify with.
You're not wrong.
Mess with the mother's child, find out what happens.
Yeah, but I know what you mean. Like, people do say that, like, I'm going into this mode to deal with this situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it happens automatically. And we each have that. Like, there's a version of yourself that has some kind of role armor for whatever profession you do that is capable of doing things in a way that your core self would not. Like, if you're in HR, capable of firing people and destroying their lives and not taking it personally, just going like, sorry, you got to go. You're terrible. But without saying that, if you're, a first responder, a version of you that knows you're walking into unspeakable terribleness. And as long as you know what to expect, you're going there with a specific job to do a specific role. And you can kind of dissociate away from your core self and just be that version of you. And we all have a number of different parts of ourself, but we see Darcy early on. We see him first involved in his like hypoarousal part, which hypo meaning less aroused, under aroused is freezing people out, like we said. But then when he switches, we see his angry part come out and his protector part gets more aggressive and starts, kind of tearing Lizzie down.
Mm-hmm. And also too, when she brings up Wickham in that proposal scene is when he gets really feisty.
Yeah.
And like comes towards her physically and really like, you see him turn it up.
Right. But it's almost a different version of his face changes, his body changes, his whole demeanor changes. And we know that that's not him. That's not his core personality. He is not that angry, hurtful, mean. Like, we actually see that he's a relatively kind man. Who's
warm and stuff. Yeah.
Right. Friendly and warm and loving to those that he lets in. But his protector part views her as a threat and comes on and turns that kind, loving, funny person right off and goes, nope, get her out of here, spikes out.
Yeah. And I can't remember where I was going to go with that, but like we said, he had to like do his own growing. And also I think Lizzie really challenged his beliefs. Like, things can't be this rigid. It's not like good people and bad people, Jane does love your friend. And also I think too, he gets to take on a protective role with Lizzie. That's also not, that's sort of like Papa Bear intensive energy, like that more anger things, like when Lydia runs off and then he helps her by taking care of her and using his like power in a more collaborative, helpful way and not like a like threatening, off-putting way, and kind of gets to, like you were saying, Ben, kind of integrate his personality more in a way that feels positive and helpful, genuinely helpful, and almost like being able to redo the narrative of what happened with his sister in a way that maybe feels more healing and less messy for him, kind of getting to, redo that narrative a little bit.
And also, I think he feels a lot of responsibility for the fuck up that Wickham is, even though he shouldn't. But like a lot of what he does, I mean, yes, it's, the story goes that it's because he's in love with Elizabeth and he wants to help her. But I think in some ways it's him feeling like he has responsibility over this person who doesn't make good decisions.
Like, I let this guy run around and now he's ruined another 15-year-old's life.
Yeah. Like now he's hurt somebody else and I need to, and I will be the one who can, well, also because he has the access and the funds to help manage that situation. But a part of it also could be like, I think he takes responsibility and not like reporting him in some way or like
disparaging him publicly.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of telling everybody what a piece of trash he is. But so I just wonder like if that's also a part of what he's trying to do to manage the way that he sees himself in that situation.
I think absolutely. And it's because one of the things about like people having parts activities, people that have been traumatized have more developed protective functions of their personality that evolve separate from your core self. Like Brittany was using the word integrated. A person who is healthy and in a calm space is able to use all of their parts, all of the functions of their personality, whether it's the attached part that wants to connect to people or the protective part or the part that needs help or can cry for help or the part that can destroy things. It can rotate through those in a way that's healthy and kind of use them as needed. But when you go through a traumatic event, such as having someone betray your trust entirely and then try to manipulate your family and hurt your sister, that would qualify of your personality having to evolve an advanced program to defend you.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that pretty clearly out of Darcy, that he has developed some advanced personality armor, that these functions come out quickly and indiscriminately once he perceives something to be a threat to those he loves or himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is there anything else that we want to say about Fitzwilliam Darcy?
Is that his name?
Oh, his name is Fitzwilliam, bro.
Yeah.
And then his cousin's named Colonel Fitzwilliam. And I'm like, why we got to do this to me as the reader of this novel?
Stupid.
Two Fitzwilliams?
I haven't read
one's the first
this.
name, one's the last name. I'm sure it's a family thing of like, we're naming him the first name after the last name of our cousin. Ugh.
I think Fitz means of. So, yeah.
Of William.
Yeah.
Okie dokie.
So, but yeah, I don't have anything else. I know I haven't read this book since I was 16. So I did not remember Mr. Darcy's name was anything other than Mr. Darcy, even though, of course I know it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe she calls him Fitz at home. Ew, I don't know. I hate that. Apologies, any Fitzes that might be listening. So next we'll talk about Elizabeth or Lizzie. She doesn't seem out. I think she's more of a product of the anxiety of the times that she's living in. I think what people like about her character is that she's almost like in the wrong time period in this story, and that she is like well-read and really intellectual and, takes on, I guess, what probably would be considered more masculine personality traits. Like she's most bonded with her father, and that kind of thing. And where we see anxiety for her is that kind of juxtaposition of someone who is trying to live within a society that wants her to fit very specific gender norms. And she doesn't, and she's not really interested in. I mean, even in the beginning-ish part of the movie, she says, I'll only marry for love. And so I'll probably not marry at all. And so we do see a character who has a strong sense, who feels like they have a strong sense of self, and that sense of self is in direct opposition with the society around her and what's expected of her. And kind of that conflict, I think, is where we most see distress come up for Lizzie.
I agree. I think Lizzie is, part of, been a feminist icon for a long time for the reason that she said, no, I'm just going to do what I want to do. I'm going to be myself and I'm not going to compromise my values. And it, works out for her. This book was really ahead of its time in having a female protagonist that instead of complying with the societal norms, she said no. And then the story works out for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is the magical realism of like a rom-com, if we're going to think of it in that context, is that it all works out in the end. Even though like her story might have been more like Jane Austen, the author's real story, which is that she never married at all because she was like, I'll marry for love or I won't marry at all. But also she was a famous writer and could provide for herself in a way that most women at that time could not.
Yeah.
And so wasn't dependent upon marriage to support her. Before we jump into this any further, though, let's take a break. Mm-hmm. So I think another character that I think is commonly linked with Lizzie in the story, and like you said, Ben, before we started recording, like a foil to Lizzie is Charlotte Lucas, who is her best friend, it seems like, and someone who is in a very different position is kind of painted in the story. I guess this is my perception of her, as she's kind of presented to us as this like saddled maid who has to marry Mr. Collins because she can't do any better. And I think, as we mentioned up top, we already recorded this episode once. And I think an interesting point that we got to with discussing the Lizzie and Charlotte kind of dichotomy is that what it really boils down to is that they are people who hold two different sets of values. And that I think where Lizzie really struggles with honestly, like seeing Charlotte is recognizing that they just have different values and that her values aren't bad. Charlotte's aren't bad just because they're not like Lizzie's. I think when I work with people, when I bring values into the conversation, I try to say like values are morally neutral. You know, your values are your values. Even if your value is like money or cars or status, like that is your value. And that, you know, and where distress comes from is not living in alignment with your values. And so, but we society really like to moralize everything. And so we also like to moralize everything from our egocentric point of view. And so we see Lizzie do that when she really, like, I think the cruelest version of Lizzie that we see is when Charlotte tells her, I'm marrying Mr. Collins. And Lizzie goes, how can you do that? He's ridiculous. And really like shames Charlotte in that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think like that moment is Lizzie facing the embodiment of her worst nightmare. Like she is seeing the potential for her life to go that way. Like this might be a position I have to be in later in my life. If I don't get married, I may have to make decisions like she does, and finds herself wondering, you know, like, could this be me? Could I have to sacrifice everything that I believe in to make a decision for my survival? And like her reaction to that is quite poor.
Absolutely. Well, and also that, to be perfectly honest, in some ways, Lizzie is also coming at this from a place of privilege. Charlotte is an only child and will have to make some choice or have to do something when her parents pass. And so I think in some ways, Lizzie is also coming from a place of privilege. Yes, a lot, especially her values. Absolutely. Like that's definitely a big part of this, but also her coming at it from a place of privilege where her father is allowing her to make these decisions on her own.
Yeah. She's very much praised and encouraged by her dad, which is radical for the time.
Absolutely. And that Charlotte, while I can't imagine that Charlotte's parents were like forcing her to say yes to this, I think that Charlotte very much was aware very much of her position.
She's already a burden to her parents.
She's 27. What are you going to do? So
old as fuck. Yeah, you're exactly right. Because Lizzie, if nothing else, Lizzie has 4 siblings who would take her in.
Yeah, exactly. And Charlotte doesn't have that experience. So, and also I think, and the other piece that what I like about this version of this film so much is that Charlotte is really looked at as someone who made the best choice for herself and seems to be pretty content. She made this choice of knowing that she needed to find she needed to find a husband. I mean, for lack of anything else, she needed to find a husband. She found somebody who she felt was manageable, and then was allowed to lead her life the way that she wanted and feel more confident in herself. I feel like it's a part of what being able to make that decision for herself, I think, was such a, and be comfortable with it and not feel like she had to do something she didn't want to do. Like, I think that's, and I think what's so interesting is that Lizzie, because she's so far up her own asshole, kind of, is that she can't see the positive aspect of that for Charlotte and really embrace the fact that Charlotte just has different values, girl. And she's in a different situation than you are.
Right. Which is a really important, I think, struggle that Lizzie deals with, is realizing, you know, that like, no, she can't perceive that at all. And that does cause her to like have this like really kind of harsh confrontation with her, which she has to work through and then see, oh no, this is actually making her happy. It wouldn't make me happy.
Yes. Which is a big growth point for a lot of people, not just Lizzie.
It is like when she goes to visit her and realizes, you know, that like, oh, you actually have kind of a good setup here. He's off doing his thing and you can kind of like live the life you want and have a role in society by being the pastor's wife, kind of. So,
and she seems really like genuinely, the way that the actor portrays her is like, she seems really like excited to like show Lizzie her house. And like, she says something like the bliss of like running your own household.
Such
like she doesn't use that word. Yeah.
Such a pleasure running my own home. That's what
she genuinely seems like she means that. And she does kind of get caught up in the Catherine de Bourgh sort of like keeping up with the Kardashians, like that version of it. Like she does seem to like, you know, kind of fall into that reality TV show energy about Catherine de Bourgh that Mr. Collins really likes, and finds peace and like contentment with her situation, which, I mean, I think where it still is a bummer is that, is there a version of Charlotte Lucas's life where she gets everything she wants? You know, because I'm sure she would have loved to like her husband more. And, you know, we have to, that's why we bring this up a lot on this podcast, but you have to be mindful of the cultural norms of anyone you work with. I mean, we're talking about the cultural norms of like 1799, but it also like is true when we work with modern day people of like, what is prioritized within your culture? Like, what are the priorities? Do you feel aligned with those priorities? And Lizzie doesn't, and Charlotte does, or seems to present as she does more. And that's okay. And so where I, as a therapist, have to be making sure that I'm wearing my therapist hat and not like my Brittany hat, like personal life Brittany, is making sure I'm not projecting my values onto Charlotte of being like, but are you sure you want to marry this guy who's not fulfilling you like this? Like, part of meeting your client where they're at is trusting them when they tell you like, this is what I want, this is what I value. And maybe they might get to a point as you work together where they recognize something different and you can help them with that. But you do have to be mindful that you're not projecting your own feelings and values onto your client.
Or your friends.
Exactly. If you want to use this knowledge for your personal lives. Yes,
absolutely. Well, and I feel like, and I also wonder for Charlotte, like, I know that Lizzie still kind of gives her a side eye about the way she acts around Catherine. But I think, but another part of me is like, if the hardest thing Charlotte has to do is act like this woman is really important and she gets to eat at her house and like have some things offered to her that maybe she wouldn't normally have offered to her because of it, and it doesn't really feel like that big of a deal.
But for someone like Lizzie, it is, because for Lizzie, her core value is
right,
like living her truth,
right?
Like being, like absolutely authentic to her wants and needs, and not conforming to the societal ways, because she sees the way that limits people, women in particular.
Yeah. And also she's in a place of privilege in order to make that decision.
Oh, of course she is.
Yeah.
I think why I like the dynamic between those two is because, for me, what I find psychologically interesting for it is watching Lizzie have to confront what her life could be. And like watch her struggle. That Keira Knightley did a really good job of kind of like letting her body act that, like, realization that like, is this what I might have to do? Because I'm watching this and she had, like a lot of kind of like side eye and kind of like minor disgust reactions that she was concealing of like, nope, but also shit. At the same time of like, oh my God, like, I mean, I couldn't marry this man because this man is about as interesting as a rock, but oh my God, might there be another one just like him that I get stuck marrying if my father passes? Because right now I have that privilege and I can gamble, but would I really be willing to gamble that much later?
Yeah.
If my life depended on it.
Who's going to be making the decision about who you marry, girl? Collins.
Is it going to be Mr. Collins? Yeah. That's true.
So you better get,
yeah.
Ooh, that's a scary thought.
Yeah. So, and I would say the only other time, this is kind of a tangent a little bit, that we see kind of more genuinely like a big emotional moment for Lizzie is when her sister gets married, like elopes with Wickham, and then she has that big like crying moment. But I think I'm only mentioning that because that is a situation that is definitely affected by the anxiety of the times, because we know that at that time, if your sister eloped, it would ruin everyone's reputation. And so then every hope that Lizzie had to have a good marriage, that Jane had to have a good marriage, Mary, Kitty, like, is fucked.
Yeah.
And what a helpless position to be in as a woman at that time, that your sister, your 15-year-old sister, can make a rash decision and probably been groomed by this creep. And because of that, all your future hopes are dashed. And so that is also like a big part of like this dynamic as well. The cultural stresses we're talking about is how there is this performative anxiety as well of like, you have to present well, and not just you, but your whole family, which I do think is why, kind of tying it all the way back up to Mrs. Bennett, part of why Lizzie might be so harsh on her mom is you're acting out of control. Your out of control behavior might fuck up not just my future, but I think Lizzie's more thinking about her sisters, Jane specifically.
Yeah.
She's very protective of her. And so I think in those moments why she can be kind of cruel to her mom as well and kind of align with her dad is like, your behavior is ruining our reputation. And that is how we will survive. That's how Jane will survive. And so you need to get your shit together. So I think the times when we see Lizzie most elevated outside the Charlotte Lucas thing is when things happen, like as a woman, so much is already out of her control. And then these other people's behaviors further that place of helplessness. And so how could she not react the way that she does? I probably would be as irritable as she is in those situations and as worked up as she is. And so this kind of, like I said, continuing to tie it back. That's why Lizzie is someone we wouldn't necessarily categorize with anxiety. She might be someone, if she came into my office after the Lydia thing, that I might give adjustment disorder because she's having to adjust to a situation that's causing her elevated distress.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. That's a great example of that. Like seeing a specific situation that was a rapid and sudden change that changed something in your life profoundly.
Yeah.
That is exactly the kind of thing that would cause that.
For sure. And so, so kind of neatly tying all that up in a bow. So is there anything else about Lizzie or Charlotte that we want to touch upon before we move forward?
I think the only thing that I would want to say about Lizzie is like recognizing the way, like, her speech to her father about her and Darcy being essentially the same person, that carrying on that same protective role within their families and responding to each other with that same degree of suspicion, though coming from different parts of, like, he hurt Jane by, blocking the marriage, or kind of, telling dude that, like, hey man, she's not that into you. So that's a gold digger, my friend. You got to let that go. And that was not the case. Jane is just kind of aloof. And she's shy. Right. And then to have them both like assume the roles provided to them by their parts, activity, and their personality, and then both have to let them go at the same time in order to show their soft, squishy, attached selves that are there to, connect to each other, and to see her not even realize that until she watches him with his sister and go, I made a lot of mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And for people to need to recognize the need to have patience with people to get past any parts activity that come with strange facial expressions and reactions that don't necessarily make sense to the situations presented, that sometimes there's something else going on. Somebody's lived something, and the parts of them that are reacting to you aren't representative of who that person is. And watching those two both have to let that go and realize that they're kind of the same person, just in different ways, I think is what makes this story endure so long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because they're soulmates, Ben. Say it, Ben.
They're soulmates.
Yes.
All right.
And what I was thinking in terms of working with couples, in terms of, that's one of the things that I work with couples the most on, is your partner's reaction to whatever is going on is based on their other experiences, and the way that they're perceiving what's going on with you has all to do with their stuff. And so we need to acknowledge that that's what's happening, and then also figure out a better way to communicate when that's happening. And also probably maybe your partner needs to see somebody on their own. But that is something that I work with couples a lot on, because there's this, the communication is almost always a problem in relationships, because a lot of us come into a relationship only experiencing the kind of communication that we saw growing up. And sometimes that communication isn't great. Not that it's bad, not that everybody had a bad experience, but more of, it might not be good, because nobody gets really trained on how to have good, healthy communication with each other. And so it's a part of what I do with couples, in terms of just helping them kind of realize that your partner is going to have experiences and thoughts and feelings about something that have nothing to do with you whatsoever. You just happen to be the person that they're closest to, who they are most often triggered by, whatever the situation is, whether it's their job, whether it's the way that you react to something, whether it's being a parent, and really helping people see that everything is not about you. Some of this is about the experience that your partner had, and how doing what Mr. Bennett does, which is completely invalidate, be disrespectful, and really push it off as something that means nothing. Because even if you think about the way that he talks about Lydia, is pretty dismissive in terms of the way that he talks about his child. And so again, communication is such a big part of all of those things. And I don't know where I was going with that, but.
Well, do you want to slide into treatment?
Yeah.
Piggyback on what you're saying and slide into treatment?
I guess. Yeah. I don't know what else I would add, I guess. So anyway, so just kind of in general, I'm going to talk a little bit about couples, and I'm going to talk a little bit about something completely different. But in terms of treatment, and in terms of kind of not necessarily so for instance, if I had Mrs. Bennett and Mr. Bennett in my office, a couple of things. One, a part of my job is assessing the relationship and assessing the flexibility that is there in terms of healing and in terms of forgiving. And it's not something that I can tell automatically, but there are signs, there are questions that I ask and things that I ask to kind of get this information from the couple. Again, as I'm sure I've talked about before, I do a couple assessment, and then I see each person individually and ask them different, questions. And then I come back and give a kind of a final result of what I've found. And that I don't know that they would make it past my assessment. Because it doesn't seem like what we see in the film. It doesn't seem like Mr. Bennett would really have any interest or feel the need to make any changes in the way that his relationship is with his wife.
He would definitely say like, she's the problem. You need to fix her.
Yeah. Like, yeah, exactly. Which, I get all the time in terms of not necessarily it being the male presenting partner versus the female presenting partner, but like it happens, like the gender piece is like neither here nor there. It just happens that way. We're like, well, they're the ones who have this and they're the ones who have that. And what am I doing in here? And it's like, I don't know. Don't you live with them? Like, aren't you the person that they spend most of their time with? I'm pretty sure that there could be something that you could learn that would be helpful for both of you. So that's a part of something that I do. And that communication is almost exclusively what I work on with pretty much everybody. And that's a lot because we are, trained and learn when we grow up in our families of how to tell somebody what we want and need or how to express thoughts and feelings. And if you were in a situation where that wasn't allowed, where nobody took you seriously, where your parents were too busy or worked too much, and so you didn't have anyone to go to, like all of that, again, not good or bad, it affects the way that we feel comfortable communicating to somebody, or even having the ability to know how we're thinking and feeling before we can figure out how to express it. And so I'm sure I talk about this all the time, but let me tell you, if you're even thinking about couples counseling, just do it. Just go fucking do it. The longer you wait, the harder it will be. The end. That's just the truth. And
the lower or more it lowers your likelihood of success. Yeah. The more you hate each other, the more resentment builds up, the less likely you are to have a couples counseling experience that is positive. And I feel like for you, people like Hannah that focus on that, like it really makes life difficult because people wait until they hate the person and are about to divorce them or leave them to come in and go fix us. And you go,
Well, here's a little side note. Here's something that you get told when you go to school and you're getting trained to work with couples is sometimes people are coming in the room so that you will tell them that they need to get divorced. Sometimes people are using your sessions so that they can definitively say, we did couples counseling and it didn't work.
Yeah, so they don't have to be the one that
they don't have to be the one who makes the fucking decision. And also they don't have to do any of the work. So just like in general, the reason why marriage counseling gets a very mixed rap is because people wait too long. People are already out of the relationship before they come in and they think it can magically be healed in 2 or 3 sessions. And 3, people aren't really willing to do the work they have to do. Couples work is hard. I tell everyone I work with, I give a whole speech about how hard couples work is before we get into it, because I need you to know that I'm going to be working really hard and so are you. And that's a part of the deal. So the other thing I'll talk about just briefly, because I feel like I'm talking, it's way too much, is that the other thing that I just wanted to kind of touch on briefly about anxiety, just kind of in general, is that one of the things that I talk to people a lot about is grounding techniques. And I'm sure that we've talked about grounding techniques before.
You can Google them as well.
Yeah, you can
find them. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the thing, though. If you Google them, you're going to get 10 gajillion answers. and not all of the answers that you get are going to be things you can actually do in the moment. One of the hardest things about managing anxiety and learning how to manage it in the moment is that you have to have something that you use to help manage that. But that thing has to be something that you can do without anybody else, or that you can do with something that you have in your pocket, and being able to do that on your own. Because the hardest thing about learning how to manage anxiety is that you have to use the grounding technique when you're experiencing at the height of the experience. And in order to do that, you have to practice. You have to find something that works for you. So I use, just in general, there's a worksheet called Grounding Techniques. It's on therapistaid.com. It is the best example of grounding techniques that I've seen put together all in one place. And it doesn't include calling a friend. There's always take a shower. If I'm having a panic attack on the bus, I can't take a fucking shower. That's not going to do anything. I can't call somebody because you can't hear on the bus when you try to talk to somebody. So they're trying to find something that you can do without needing something else to happen can really be helpful, and also helps calm your body down so you can figure out what you need to do next. Sometimes that's, I need to come home and I do need to talk to a friend. I need to come home and take a nap. Maybe I haven't eaten, like and really be able to give yourself a chance to kind of manage the aftermath of experiencing a panic attack or increased anxiety. Okay, I think that's it.
Hannah, I'm so proud of you. You have been so active in this session or this episode.
This session.
Freudian slap.
But no, this is like, I think the most often you've talked. It's not one. I'm just so glad that you're doing that because you're awesome.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ben.
Would you like to go next with treatment, Ben?
Sure. So I think for treatment, I think I would want to focus primarily on Darcy. I think Darcy fits my realm of specialty the best, and also the ability to work with men on undoing some of the impacts of toxic masculinity on the available range of emotions to us is something that I spend a lot of time on, given what the population I typically work with, and have to communicate to people that our feelings exist for a reason, and they are the only way we assign relevance to our experience. They are not optional. They are not negotiable. We cannot just shut them out. Much like a cut on our hand, once the body detects a wound, it will continue to send healing hormones and signals until the wound is healed. And it will do the same with mental wounds that it does with emotional ones. And this tendency men have, and we're told our entire life, to just push it down, shut up, do what you need to do, take care of your family, go to work, rub dirt on it, etc., drink water, drive on, any of the little idioms you want to use.
Yeah.
I think Darcy being a victim to that, of never having an opportunity to process what happened to him, which is the way I interpreted the scene with Elizabeth, where he finally releases that and tells the story of what this man did.
Absolutely.
And watching like what happens to him when he releases that and finally processes through those emotions, releasing the tears, releasing the anger, and not just being trapped in part of the emotion. So for me, I think working with Darcy on understanding how he's protecting himself from those feelings and how that's keeping him stuck, like doing the trauma work around that would be my focus, of going like, we have to reprogram how you're thinking about this. And that desire to keep yourself protected from the bad emotions, or the really common thing I see with people who've had particularly like relationship traumas like that, is it took them everything that they had to recover from that. But because it hurt them so badly, they never had the opportunity to really feel all of it, because they shut it down. Mm-hmm. And the remnants of those feelings are still stuck and never dealt with, but they viewed those feelings themselves as a threat, and like they have the possibility to destabilize them if they ever let them out of the box that they have them locked in. So they stay there and then continue to impact and color the way you see things, much like we see Darcy interpret everything and everyone until he lets this out and digests it, and then is able to become his core self. So I think for me, that would be my area of focus, is working on helping Darcy understand how the machine inside of him works, and understand that anxiety, that need to protect yourself, comes from the bad experience that you had, the really extremely hurtful betrayal, and that the feelings you've been protecting yourself from are actually keeping you stuck in a protective mode you don't need anymore.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely.
That would be my direction.
Okay. I guess I will pick Mrs. Bennett. I don't think she would necessarily come to therapy on her own volition. I think this would be a situation, how I'm imagining it, the fanfic I'm writing in which she will come into therapy, is that all her children are married and she's still a mess. And then all of her kids are like, if you want to keep visiting us in our home and be around our grandchildren, you have to get your shit together. And so if she were to come to me, I think a really good route to take with her would be dialectical behavioral therapy. There are two, and I'll be short about this. If you want to learn more about it, it's really easy to research DBT. There's a ton of workbooks about it that are really action oriented. And there are two major tenets to it, which is distress tolerance. How to, like, grounding techniques, like Hannah mentioned, can be a big part of DBT. Being mindful, being present, that kind of thing. And then the other tenet is interpersonal effectiveness techniques, which is what I referenced earlier, which is how do I communicate to others? So first step, I would teach her how to use distress tolerance skills to manage her internal, making her aware of her internal state and how it's connected to her emotions, and like that sort of like more the cognitive behavioral therapy cycle of like our feelings, our behaviors, our feelings, our thoughts, our behaviors, and our physical sensations. So getting her aware of that, teaching her grounding techniques, figuring out which ones resonate most with her, and how do we use the signals within our anxiety and our bodies to signal to us, like Hannah was saying, okay, let's use this skill now. The next thing I would do then, once we've kind of got that locked down, is how do we communicate with others? Similar to how I was talking about before, really telling her, like trying to instruct her that if you really want people to understand you and hear what you're saying, you need to change how you're doing this. A really solid skill for that, if you want to Google this as well, is Dear Man, sometimes called Dear Woman. It is a long acronym, so all of those letters stand for something. And I'll do a rundown really quick, and then that'll be my treatment. So the Dear part is sort of how you structure what you want to say. So the D stands for describe the situation, what literally happened. No editorializing, just the facts. The E is express your emotion about the situation. The A is ask for what you need, be specific and concrete, and the R is reward the listener. Reward the listener either by saying thank you or this is how it would benefit you. So an example of a dear and how I would encourage her to use it is, hey, the other day, when, I'm trying to think of an example from the movie, when Lizzie turned down Mr. Collins' proposal, because that's just a fact. That's just a situation. She didn't say, when Lizzie was acting like a brat the other day, you just say what literally happened. And then you'd say, I felt scared and anxious about her and angry about her turning down that situation. And I feel anxious maybe of how you reacted. If she's giving this to like Mr. Bennett. Yeah. Then the ask would be, I need a hug about this, or I need to talk about it, or I need you to validate how I'm feeling. So you want to give, not just say to your person, I need you to be more supportive. That's not concrete enough. You really want to say like, this is what I need you to do specifically for me to feel supported. And then the reward the listener would be, you can literally just say thank you for listening to me and trying to meet my need. And like I said, it can also be like, this is how my ask will also benefit you. If you could do this for me, I will be easier to live with. I won't keep nagging at you about this situation. Like I won't scream, and that'll be better for you. The woman part, I guess, is more like how we take accountability for the way we're giving the dear is so like willingness to not get your way. That doesn't really apply to this situation, but basically it's like, don't go into Dear Woman, like communicating, thinking if this person doesn't give me exactly what I'm asking for, I'm going to lose my shit. So don't only hinge your regulation on their response. The O is observe inside yourself. Basically, am I too anxious to have this conversation right now? Am I too upset? So do the grounding, distress tolerance skills before you jump into the dear. The M is be mindful of your environment. Don't try to have this conversation when someone is distracted by something else, when maybe you're around other people. So maybe not have this conversation in front of Lizzie would be mindful of the environment. Is this...
No arguments in the car when you're driving. Go ahead, Brittany.
A is active listening skills, or like act confident. So basically eye contact, tone of voice, appropriate social skills kind of. And N is negotiate. So basically what that means is like a dear can also be a way to open up a dialogue for a compromise of like, I don't know if I can give you your full ask like you're saying, but what about this? And then having a conversation. So I think things like Dear Woman, things like distress tolerance, I think would really help Mrs. Bennett if she was willing to do them. And I think they could really help her communicate better with her loved ones and ideally help her feel heard in a way that's actually genuine and not people just reacting to her reactions. Mm-hmm. So we'll go one more break and then we will go to final thoughts. Okay. Final thoughts. Ben, I'm going to have you go first because I know your final thoughts.
Well, fair. So my final thoughts on this movie, first off, it is not the Batman.
Barf.
I just had to.
Good.
I had
you
to.
actually
I had
didn't
to.
because we've already talked about Batman twice, but whatever. Go ahead.
Well, now it's 4 times, so I feel like I just kind of made up for anyone's last
Keep
season.
it in your pants.
No, just kidding. I think that this movie was done beautifully. I think it was acted beautifully. I think that the story has existed for so long, for so very many reasons. And it just tells a fantastic human story that also is a beacon of feminism and a beacon of making sure that your life turns out the way you want while also having to create space for letting other people have the life that they feel they need. Mm-hmm. And learning that sometimes we have to recognize when our parts activity or parts of ourselves that exist for past situations are replaying in situations we don't need them for and block you from having the life you want. And that you have to reckon with that before anyone can love you and before you can love anyone else.
But did you like the movie?
Do I like the movie? Is this something I would seek
final
out?
Thoughts, bro.
He's giving a good answer. I like his answer.
I appreciate and respect the movie. It is not my jam. It's not something I would seek out to watch on my own. I would probably not watch it again unless there was a reason for me to watch it. But that doesn't mean that I think it's a bad movie. It's just not my thing. I think it's a really well done movie and great acting, etc. But yeah, this just total period is not my jam. I thought Jane Eyre is a phenomenal book, and I hated this one. I don't know why. Interesting.
I'm gonna write that down in the notebook I have about you. Likes Jane Eyre more than Pride and Prejudice. Interesting.
You will never figure me out.
Interesting. Also, that's a different author. That's a different vibe. I don't feel like the vibes are the same. So I hear you.
Yeah, no, it's totally not the same at all. Mm-hmm. This movie's just, this style is not my jam, but it was a great film and deserved the accolades it got.
I can go next. I fucking love this movie. This movie, Pride and Prejudice, I was a hella dork and I actually owned the DVD, 2-part DVD of the 90s version, the BBC version with like Colin Firth. And I think her name is Jennifer Beals. And so when this movie came out, I was yoked for this movie to come out. And then I saw it and I was like, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. So I love this movie. I own this movie. I have the soundtrack to this movie. I used to listen to the soundtrack a lot. This movie also came out during a period of my life in which I was hella depressed. And so I also used to just play this movie on a loop. My sophomore year of college. So it also has the tinge of like being a comfort movie during a time when I really needed it. And so I hold it dear to my heart, I think, for that reason as well. But also Matthew McFadden is my favorite Darcy. I just think this movie was beautifully done, like the best adaptation of this movie that there could be. I adore it 1,000 times over.
I also really love this movie. It also came for me at a time when I was very depressed and struggling a lot, and also would watch it on repeat while I turned away from it on my couch. Because
very depression kitty, from
very
Big Mouth
depression
energy.
kitty. Yes, absolutely. Which is why when that happened on Big Mouth, I was like, "Shut up! Nobody asked you." So.
Just put on Pride and Prejudice in the background and go to bed.
Exactly. So, but I love this movie. I think it's beautiful. When it came out, I definitely was experiencing one of the harder times of my life. And so I think I saw it in the movie theater more than once. I think I definitely own the DVD. And I just love it. And I'll watch it, a gajillion times more, I'm sure. Just because it's a comfort film at this point. So, and even listening to the music reminds me of how comforted I was during a time when it was really hard to feel anything good. That this movie was able to do that. So yeah, so I love this film.
All right. Well, as always, thank you for joining us. And you can find us at Popcorn Psychology on Facebook and Instagram, at popcorn_psych on Twitter, Popcorn Psychology on TikTok. You can always email us at popcornpsychology@gmail.com. That's the best place to start a communication with us if you are wanting to recommend movies that you'd like us to talk about or anything along those lines. We also have a Patreon, which we do a horrible job shouting out. So if you look for us on patreon.com, I think /popcorn psychology, you can become a patron. You get early access to our episodes on top of other perks. And we are a scrappy little bunch. So it always helps to get any support that we can. Also, I feel like, you can find merch, tpublic.com. You can find merch for us as well if you would like to wear or own something with our logo on it. So with that, thank you for your patience with this episode. I'm excited that we got to revisit it and talk about Pride and Prejudice. And we wish you all a lovely, lovely day.